across all of the Caribbean nations. And this workshop is in collaboration with Columbia University, the group on health education. And it's truly my honor to then now turn it over to Dr. Cecilia Sorensen, who's going to tell us more about the exciting agenda. Dr. Sorensen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lichfeld. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this incredible workshop. My name is Cecilia Sorensen. I'm the director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, which is based at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And this is part of our effort to really strengthen capacity building and knowledge around climate and health throughout the world. And we're really excited to have you all here today to be really focusing in on the Caribbean. So give me 1 minute here. I'm going to share my slide and let you all know what we have in store for today. Okay, so we have an exciting agenda planned. Part one of this event, we are going to be hearing from experts from the region as well as globally on the syndemic threats of climate change and COVID-19. We'll be hearing brief presentations about air quality and climate change, food systems, agriculture, and climate and health, as well as mental health and climate change. Then we're going to have a Q&A, and then we'll go into small breakout groups for about 20 minutes, where we'll be talking about prioritizing agendas for the region. We'll then come back to this large room and have about a 10-minute wrap-up. That will all last roughly 75 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, get some coffee, get some water, get a bite to eat, and then please come back and join us for part two, where we'll be talking about health system resilience in a changing climate and digital solutions. We'll be hearing from 3 expert speakers from the region about green and resilient health systems, forced migration, climate change and health, and how we can train Caribbean health professionals to tackle the climate crisis. After that, we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll also, again, go into small breakout rooms where we'll be discussing prioritization of agendas for the region, and then we'll have a large wrap-up. So we're really delighted to have you all here for this exciting workshop. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Maureen Lichfeld to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Lichfeld is the Dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you all so much.
Thank you and good morning again. It's truly an honor, and every time I do this, it becomes an even greater honor to introduce the first speaker today. Dr. Jonathan Patz is a true colleague for many, many years and was the inaugural director of the Global Health Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But very recently, he stepped down to focus his entire career and a big part of his life on climate and health. He is the Tony McMichael Professor and the John P. Holton Chair of Health and the Environment, with appointments at the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies and the Department of Population Sciences. But I know Jonathan most for his pioneering work as lead author of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, short for IPCC, an organization that received the 2007 Nobel Prize with Al Gore. We also know him as the co-chair of the expert panel of the US National Assessment on Climate and Change, a report that is mandated by the Congress of the United States. And we are true partners in crime as a member for the National Academy of Medicine. So please, Dr. Jonathan Patz, he is going to focus on air quality and climate change.
Maureen, thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here. And just for clarification, I did co-chair the health report of the first U.S. National Assessment on Climate Change, not the current one, but the first. So let me share my screen and let me know if this looks good to everybody. They can see my screen now.
Looks great, Jonathan.
Okay, great. So I'm going to cut right to the chase. And we all know about the climate crisis and the last IPCC report. UN Secretary General Guterres labeled it as code red for humanity. But I want to talk about the actions and mitigation, what we need to do. This was a report out of the Paris Agreement of 2015 when world leaders asked the IPCC, what would it take to cut emissions to stay below a 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold above pre-industrial levels? And the answer was, we need to cut emissions almost in half by the end of this decade. So in 8 years, we need to cut emissions 45%, mostly from less burning of fossil fuels, but also, cutting rainforests is also a contributor, and then get to net zero by 2050. So this is a crisis. It has to happen fast. My view as a public health practitioner and researcher is that the actions we take to mitigate climate change could be golden opportunities for health. And I've listed the 3 main sectors here, and Liz will talk about the food sector in a minute, but I'm just going to focus on the energy sector. We all know that air pollution is harmful, and these statistics from the WHO estimate that 7 million people die prematurely every year from air pollution. So something that we know is a major problem for environmental health. I want to just show you one result from a study we released in May. It's a study of the neighbor of the Caribbean region, the United States. And we asked the question, if we could decarbonize energy across sectors, so the electric power generation, transportation, oil refineries, buildings, what would that mean for reduction of fine particulate pollution that harms people? So decarbonizing across sectors, what would the PM 2.5 benefit be? And we found that 53,000 lives would be saved every year, an equivalent of $6 billion every year in avoided death and hospitalization. So not trivial, and this is we see. The darker the blue, the more the benefit from getting away from fossil fuels. I can see that Pittsburgh, the Ohio River Valley has still a lot of coal-fired power plants. So Pittsburgh would do very well in this scenario, and you can see other parts of the country. And the Caribbean region, of course, is fossil fuel dependent, some countries more than others, so there would be major benefits to health from improved air quality. Just a quick note about COVID-19. This is a pandemic that we continue to grapple with. It turns out that air pollution increases the risk of dying. And look at these regional estimates for North America and East Asia. If you have COVID, and you're exposed to air pollution, fossil fuel emissions causing that air pollution is responsible for an increased risk of dying by almost 15%. That's not insignificant. So confluence of air pollution increasing the risk of COVID is pretty serious. Finally, I want to just talk about what policymakers are thinking about. Clean energy may cost more. Maybe to avoid emitting 1 ton of CO2 in the air, you must invest $30 in energy technology. But for every ton of CO2 that you avoid emitting, the reduction in fine PM 2.5 goes down such that for every ton avoided, you would save $200 in avoided mortality and morbidity. So I asked the decision makers which number is bigger, and many of them have told me we are only thinking about the $30. Maybe we should start thinking about the health benefit because it's far greater. And in other more polluted countries, it'd be even higher. So I'll just end by saying we're in a new era where $30 for energy investment, that could be a huge overestimate, especially when you look at the price of solar. It's dropped 300-fold in the last few decades. It's dropped 80% in the last 7 years. And for the first time ever, if you reduce all government subsidies for electricity generation, the cheapest way to generate electricity now is from renewable and batteries. We're in a new era, you know. And finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment in energy technology that we've ever had in history. You know, $369 billion for clean energy, $20 billion for clean climate, agriculture that Liz will talk a little bit more about. And across these sectors, the reduction in emissions will get us almost to our pledge to the UN of getting to 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. So I'll end there. This is positive, you know, progress here, and it's an important, very important step. Of course, we need to do more. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Patz, and we will hold questions till the end. I am double checking if Dr. St. John has joined. Don't see her quite.
Yes, she's on now.
Yeah, she's online. Okay.
Here.
She is here. Dr. St. John, welcome.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, here we are. Thank you so much. And I was mentioning what an honor it is, Dr. St. John, to have this 5th joint conference with the annual Caribbean Agency for Public Health conference. And we couldn't have done it without the leadership of Dr. Joyce St. John, who is the Chief Executive Officer of it. Dr. St. John, in addition to having this tremendous leadership for all of our Caribbean island nations, brings herself a significant expertise in climate and health. And so when I reached out to Joy and said, could you make some opening remarks? The answer was swift and quickly a yes. And so it's such an honor to join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce St. John.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And you neglected to tell them that you reached out to me when it was my birthday last year.
That is true. That is true.
The only bad thing about this is that you're not having this here in Jamaica. We are right here.
I will do better next year.
So, Dr. Maureen Litchfield, Dean and Professor, University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. Dr. Celia Sorensen, Director, Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, Columbia University. PAHO officers, and I recognize Dr. Booth and Dr. Paulson Edwards. Environmental health officers, climate and health professionals from CARPHA member states, other team members of the pre-CARPHA workshop on climate and health. Good morning. I am happy to address you today as we commence this webinar, Human Health Impact of Climate Change, as part of this year's meetings in the margins of the 66th Annual CARPHA Health Research Conference. In the region, we must not forget that we face a real threat of climate change, and more so, the effects of climate change on our health. And so I thank you for keeping this topic current. In the last decade, we have seen unprecedented floods, hurricanes, and even the loss of coastal lands with increasing intensity as well as frequency. In the last few years, the sargassum overgrowth and toxic smell have even caused issues with tourists and avid swimmers like me, who frequent many of our beaches throughout the Caribbean. These all have health and economic impacts, but they affect livelihood. CARPHA has supported research into the impacts of sargassum on the region, and they're not insignificant. The ecosystems that we knew when growing up are so changed as a result of human activity that some do not exist anymore. And the loss of marine biodiversity especially is affecting coastal integrity, the fishing industry, tourism, with irreversible impacts on the blue economy. For the purpose of this webinar, the focus is the impact of climate change on health. We can immediately identify both direct and indirect effects. The increases in weather-precipitated morbidity and mortality are concerning, as we continue to see increases in the incidence and intensity of extreme weather events, droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves, and cold spells. These are not only direct but catastrophic impacts of climate change on human health. Where we must be more vigilant, though, and where we seldom recognize the dangers of climate change are the indirect negative impacts. ECLAC concluded that climate change intensified diseases cause increased prevalence of respiratory diseases through exposure to mold from extreme or more frequent precipitation, air pollutants, and aerosolized marine toxins due to increased temperature, coastal runoff, and humidity, dust from droughts and Sahara events. Increased food and waterborne illnesses, including agrochemical use for food production, proliferation of disease-causing biological agents, malnutrition due to staple food shortages and food contamination, increased prevalence of vector-borne and zoonotic diseases, expansions in vector ranges to previously colder climes and mountain ranges, shortening of vector and pathogen incubation periods, increased bite rates, disruption and displacement of large human populations, often due to severe flooding and landslides. And then there's the negative impact on mental health due to geographic displacement of populations, damage to property, loss of loved ones, and chronic stress, which often results in increased drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, depression, anxiety. CARPHA's Environmental Health and Sustainable Development, Vector-Borne Disease, and other technical departments have embarked on a number of partnerships to conduct system strengthening activities to mitigate the impact of climate on environmental and human health. Making the systems more climate resilient can only be accomplished by responding in a multi-sectoral health in all policies manner. CARPHA continues to collaborate with many sectors and funding agencies and development agencies towards addressing the impacts and the effects of climate change in the region directly and through joint work with our partner agencies such as PAHO. You, the member state representatives and other climate change and health-related professionals are the key technical focal points to be advocates for mitigating the negative impacts of climate change on human health. I encourage you to reference CARPHA's publication of the State of Public Health in the Caribbean Report 2017 to 2018 on climate and health, averting and responding to an unfolding health crisis. You can find this on our website. I promise you that after reading this publication, you will thoroughly appreciate all the work being done in the region to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change on health. I am hopeful that you will utilize all the resources available to you to fight for the preservation of the ecosystems that I knew in my childhood. In order to achieve all the sustainable development goals, we must work together to reverse the negative impacts of climate change. I wish you a successful workshop. Over to you, and I apologize for being late, but technology.
Well, we're so honored, Dr. St. John, to have you, and I know you have a packed couple of days, beginning with today. So you just giving us a few minutes is quite exceptional. Thank you. We will deliver to you at the end of today a research agenda, an action agenda for research policy and practice, but also the priorities that the member states have identified to address in the area of climate and health. And so at the end of the workshop, we will do so. Please stay on as long as you can, but I know you have to zip off to many other meetings.
I have to skedaddle, but I really do appreciate you giving me that research agenda, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And so now it's my honor to introduce another colleague, which fits right into following the remarks of Dr. St. John in the area of agriculture and food systems. Dr. Liz Willits practices medicine in resource-poor settings and participates in global fora on environment and sustainable development. And it's through that, through those fora, I began to know Dr. Willits, and particularly her participation in several National Academy of Medicine Consortium workshops. She served in a long-term role in primary care in Micronesia, is bilingual, is connected to Harvard, the Harvard Brigham and Women's Hospital. But I know Dr. Willits most for her work internationally on food systems and sustainable development through WHO and through other many international organizations. And so I've asked her, and she immediately agreed to talk to us about food systems, agriculture, climate change, and health. Dr. Willits.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen here. And just a confirmation that you can hear me and you can see my screen.
We can hear you and see your screen, Liz. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maureen, for the invitation to be here. This is quite an honor, and I really look forward to learning from this group. And I appreciate Dr. St. John's words, and absolutely, I think I would follow on several of her points, including the one key point that I will end with as well, which is that the public health sector can be an advocate for the environmental change that we really need and are calling for, as well as for the systems thinking that needs to happen to address things such as food, which is extremely complicated. And I will just, a couple of points before getting started is, thank you, Maureen, for the background on me. One thing that I'm really proud of, actually, I work in the global space on climate change now, and I follow many of the global processes in the UN system on environment, but I am very proud to dial back into my experience in public health nutrition, where I started my career, and I started my career in implementation and practice. And I know in our prep calls, this was a very important area to really bring it back home. And I wanted to just comment again that where the global conversation is on climate change and food systems is on implementation. And that's exactly what public health and health agencies are expert at and are trying to, I think this is an opportunity to connect dots. So the other thing I will say is yesterday, I was on the opposite time zone. So if I'm a little less sharp than I usually am, I apologize. But I'm operating on Asia Pacific right now. So let me switch to my next slide. And my presentation is going to try to connect these dots, global to local, local to global. I'm going to walk through a couple of concepts that in my research I've observed are quite important to getting this integrated governance between health and environment moving in the right direction, in a positive, progressive direction, and then speak a bit about the Caribbean itself in this space, and then conclude with some kind of points moving forward, recommendations on food systems specifically, and connecting health and environment. So the first concept I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. I know this is a public health group, and I bring this term to the fore because determinants of health is really part of the common language in public health, in global health, but it is really absent in the environmental community and among climate experts. And if we're trying to find a point of synergy and common ground to move forward and a way to fill gaps, one starting point is definitely finding that common language and bringing environmental determinants of health into the public health scope, as well as expanding it into the environmental sector is really a low-hanging fruit. And of course, climate change is a determinant of health, directly and indirectly. And another concept I wanted to bring to the fore is food systems are incredibly complicated. The nexus that exists between climate change and health and food systems is massive. And one way I like to think about it is as a joint footprint, so a health environment footprint. And I've thrown together a few points here, and I put them in a specific order. The first couple of points are the domain where the health sector traditionally sits, and the rest of the bullet points are the domain for where the environmental sector traditionally sits. And I put them here like this to show the expanse of that footprint and to draw attention to two key points on this. One, any policy change to any one of these dimensions is going to affect the other in food systems. And then secondly, food affects nutrition. And so nutrition is a determinant of health, but food also affects a great deal of other determinants of health, including environmental and social. And so looking at them all into one footprint, it can be very valuable. And I'll just briefly go through. This is a global list. It's not focused on the Caribbean region, but some of this data isn't available at that level. So we'll just talk globally how big this problem is. 3 billion people worldwide are diagnosed with malnutrition. That includes an impressive over 500 million diagnosed with diabetes. And the cost of this is approximately $3 trillion a year. Then food systems also are responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 8% of which are resulting from food loss and waste. And then food systems also use 70% of freshwater use and are a leading polluter of freshwater ecosystems. And that pollution eventually gets to many marine ecosystems as well. And then food systems are also a leading driver of biodiversity loss and unintentional rearrangement of ecological relationships. And we think that in that sense, antimicrobial resistance, changes to pollinators, and relationships with wildlife. And then ultimately, food systems produce food to eat. And yet many, many people eat unhealthy, unsustainable, unsafe, low diversity, and high carbon diets. So we have a very large problem, and the health environment footprint is a very useful way to bring it all together into one package. So moving on to the next slide, the third key point I wanted to raise was about the burden of environmental disease. Globally, we know and are increasingly recognizing that environmental degradation has a very large impact on global mortality. Now, the question is, do we have the mechanism to address this, the environmental determinants of health, at the global and national level? Usually I do this presentation for the global level, and the next slides I'll tease apart both of these scales. And I understand that the group here for this session may not have immediate touch points into the global processes, such as the global climate change meetings, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some may have that connection, but many may not. So this slide is a brief overview, just looking at, for example, the health environment footprint. And when global decisions are made on that footprint in environmental forums on climate change, on forests, in marine issues, the ministries that negotiate those decisions affect the health environment footprint. But those ministries are traditionally foreign affairs, agriculture, environment. So that means at the global level, It's non-health ministries who are making decisions on this health environment footprint. And in our research, we found this very interesting and looked specifically at over on the left-hand side, you'll see UNFCCC, that's the climate body. Only 12% of the last delegations in 2021 were from health ministries, but they may not have even been negotiating. And then under the UN Committee on World Food Security at its last session, only 6% were from health ministries. And then the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, we're not even sure what the accounting is on the breakdown of which ministry attends. And it's possible that no health ministries attended whatsoever. So at the global level, do we have the mechanisms to address this footprint, including food systems in those decisions? And the answer is pointing to the negative on that. So switching over to the local level and looking at kind of the policy coherence and opportunity for integrated governance at the national level, there are very well-known challenges to why this isn't getting off the ground as well. The number one often cited is the funding barriers to do integrated work, and then also the capacity to work across sectors, and the idea that national plans are heavily siloed and not necessarily coherent. So for example, nutrition and agriculture plans traditionally aren't aligned, and nutrition and climate change strategies aren't generally aligned. Next slide. Now moving into the Caribbean focus. So moving forward on food systems in the Caribbean, I wanted to put together some data in both of these domains just to put it out here. And I recognize I'm not as much of an expert on the Caribbean as this group is, but the basic, and you're likely familiar with the statistics more than I am, but non-communicable diseases, including the diet-related ones, are the leading cause of death and disability in the region. And that leads to over 50% of deaths. So this is the nutrition diet-related statistic, side by side with what we generally know about climate change in the region. Dr. St. John mentioned many of these, but it's going to lead to water scarcity, changes in pest management, insecurity of food and water, changes to livestock, and general social vulnerability, and have diverse impact on the food system, including the terrestrial and the marine environments. But then when we look at the information that exists in the Caribbean, and this is the building block for really moving the integrated governance together, such as on food systems, there's some big gaps. I found a review paper from this year that was looking at specifically the details of food systems in this region, and it came up with some really interesting results, including that there are fewer articles published on climate and health in the Caribbean than other regions of the world. There is also very little research on the impacts of climate change on environmental determinants of health, even the basic ones like food and water and sanitation. And then despite that, globally, the global bodies have very strong information on the links between climate change and foodborne disease, food safety, and impacts to production. Even those very well recognized categories globally, there's still not, there's very minimal research and data done in the Caribbean region. And that there's quite a need to improve the regional collaboration to build this research and evidence base on food systems. So with that, I also wanted to note that CARPHA is producing an assessment, actively producing, and I believe Maureen would know more about that than I would. But I did want to make sure that despite those gaps, there is work being underway to look at the gaps in the food system, at least related to the food safety baseline and some resilience in that sense. So moving to the next section, which is, well, what do we do to build this integrated governance in this space on climate change, food systems, and health, and protect health? I'll speed up a little bit through this slide since I think I'm running short on time, but the research that we've done at the global level is very comparable to what would be useful at the national level, because we're converging at this point of implementation. Implementation is the key. It's about having a common language between the sectors. It's about bringing health science and health expertise into the decision-making processes on environment, and about kind of thinking about public health strategy as a way to implement environmental decisions. And there's also the UN General Assembly approved a human right to a clean environment, and that can be another tool for the health sector. Last two slides, the first one's on national food systems. The next one will be on the global level. Just three main points concluding from the kind of the presentation as a whole. Recognize the idea that climate change and food systems are global issues with local impacts. And so they need global and local solutions, and tying those together is important. And then that the fact that global agreement, for example, on climate change and local implementation can be mutually reinforcing. And what I mean by that is public health is a driver for addressing environmental determinants. It's a driver for implementing the climate change agreement. And I know that Daniel will speak about this in the next session in terms of the national adaptation plans, the health national adaptation plans, the national determining contributions. And then also the fact that public health sectors can drive and advocate for a stronger global climate change agreement that would protect food systems through mitigation and resilience, et cetera. And then there's the big issue with data, which we spoke about, and then the role that the health sector could play in building that data information space that not only is going to protect health and the environmental determinants of health at the local level, but also can inform the global climate processes. And then lastly, that health prevention could be scoped to include the environment to be most protective. And that could be along preparedness and surveillance and long-term risk reduction. Globally, again, I was not sure how close the touch point was to this, from this group to the UNFCCC processes. But this year, as with in following years, there will be great opportunities for health ministries to really push the agenda and what's happening at the global level. The annual climate change meeting this year, it's known as COP27. It's the 27th meeting of the parties. It will be able to take decision on agriculture in terms of whether there's even a negotiating space to discuss food systems in the global climate conversation. That conversation currently doesn't exist, but it should, and it really needs to. And that conversation needs to be comprehensive, aligned with the global health agenda, with a biodiversity agenda, and with making ties to the local and national context. Let me stop there. I think I've gone plenty over, but thanks so much. And if happy to go into details on any aspect that might be most interesting to this group.
Thank you, Liz. Really, not only food for thought, but food for action. And we will come back to you with questions, and as well as feed the breakout groups that are coming. But it's now my honor to introduce a local, someone in the region who is a leader in the area of mental health. Dr. Peter Douglas Weller is a Jamaican, and so he's right at home during the conference, who has integrated professional training in community clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and public health with his passion for wellness and social justice. He brings insights and interventions from his 30-year professional career clinical practice. He's also the co-chair of the Disaster Mental Health Committee of the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations, and a council elder. His focus truly is on capacity building and the intersectionalities of culture, gender, mental health, and climate and environmental issues. And so this morning, Dr. Elder will focus on mental health and climate change, and how climate change contributes to the burden of mental health disorders in the Caribbean. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Weller.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair Maureen. It's a pleasure to be here. Greetings to all the colleagues. We're having some connectivity problems, so I'm grateful for my colleagues who are going to manage my slides, which I'm going to move through very quickly. We're talking about climate change and mental health, and I'm representing the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. We're going to be trying to see how we can facilitate a resetting of the focus, a changing of mindsets that will better facilitate both climate change positively and mental health. Now, I just want to begin by emphasizing that I'm sharing perspectives that are coming from my colleagues at CARPHA. Psychologists across the region are involved in many aspects of wellness, of health, and related areas and target groups. So the next slide is reminding us that mental health very often is not getting the attention it should, given the psychological impacts of disasters and climate change related events. But I think maybe what has happened since 2018 is that with COVID, mental health and behavior have come into greater focus with regard to the issues of pandemics, and the syndemic perspectives that integrate all the different factors are getting more attention. So maybe what we need to consider is what is being paid attention and who is getting the attention. Because as we look at trying to change behaviors, both in terms of mental health and climate, we need to perhaps take a more close look at the behaviors and the process of behavior change. So point number one I want to emphasize is that we talk about mental health, but we're really talking about, and let's go to the next slide. We're looking at it not only in the World Health definition of a state of well-being, but emphasizing the whole area that it's the normal stresses of life that we must help people to learn to manage so that they can then manage the more disastrous ones. And certainly climate change is becoming a normal stressor, and we need to understand it in that way. We need to also understand that when we talk about mental health, we're talking about relating to the mind, involving the process of thinking. So we really have to focus our psychosocial attentions on the head and the heart, the thoughts and the feelings, if we're going to change behavior. And I wanted to take us back to a point that Dr. Willits made earlier. You know, mental health is a determinant of climate change as well. We very often see, and as behavioral scientists, we are concerned that our flowcharts very often do not acknowledge how mental health and how our behavior influence these grand issues that we face in society. So in the same way that mental health affects our choices, it affects how we engage with the environment, it affects how we cope with the environment, but it also affects how we change the environment. And so that is something that we perhaps need to consider as we look at prioritizing and paying attention to mental health and behavior. Next slide. So we'll move through these quickly. I mean, this is just a quick review. Very often, the paradigm we use is to look at the psychosocial consequences in terms of the direct effects, the mental and physical trauma, and the indirect, the mental and psychosocial issues coming out of economic, environmental, and other disruptions. And then we look at the more overarching long-term effects of the emotional distress as a result, not only of the threats and the impacts, but the anticipation. So we have issues that we'll talk about like eco-anxiety, etc. Next slide. Other presenters, and Dr. St. John in particular, highlighted some of these issues. So I won't go into the details, simply to say that every physical health challenge has a mental health challenge. Whether it is vector-borne diseases causing stress, causing disruption, whether it is the heat and the morbidity and the changes in the chemicals in the body and the cognitive impairment of the elderly, whatever it is, mental health effects are felt worse when they're pre-existing conditions. So we talk about the post-traumatic stress responses. It doesn't have to be a disorder, but it can be a response. Depression, the solastalgia, the overwhelming sense of loss, anxiety, both anticipatory and of course eco-anxiety. We have the complications of grief and loss, the dislocations and the refugees, the unhealthy coping, including substance abuse, and the extreme responses such as suicidal ideation, and of course, the aggression and violence. So in every health issue, there is a mental health issue. But again, as I emphasize, it's not a one-way direction. For every health issue, if you want to change it, you need to change the mindsets that accompany it, the mindsets that are the drivers of not only the health challenge, but the factors leading to that health challenge, such as climate change. Next slide. So, and again, most of us here in this forum will know about how climate change is affecting the Caribbean. So, you know, we have all the hurricane-related psychopathology. We talk about all the distress that is being experienced. We talk about, for example, in the Bahamas, the anticipatory anxiety. We have so little data, and it's unfortunate because we have done many good interventions, but there's a weakness in collecting the psychological data around how climate change and disasters affect us in the Caribbean. The CARPHA's report, of course, gives some information about the good work being done, but we need to collect more data that we can, so we can better understand this complex interplay of cause and effect, and drivers and impact. Next slide. So it's all about the mind. And I just put these slides in because we have mindsets that are influencing all of us, policy, program, public. The first image reminds us that we tend to look at this hierarchical structure of man, woman, humans at the top, you know, adults, then children, then animals, and then things. And of course, nature does not operate like that. This kind of pyramidal, hyper power, you know, control kind of mindset is really common in all aspects of our work. And I'll talk about it a little more as we go along. But maybe we need to be able to try to shift the focus and see us all as part of this ecosystem with impacting each other. And this needs to be something that needs to be challenged, because the image to the right, as many of you will know, it's a very popular image, the picture of a woman. Some of you will be looking at it and seeing an old woman. Some will be seeing a young woman. Some may be seeing other things. But one thing is for sure, most people do not see both. And this is one of the things that we have to understand about the science of psychology and perception and cognitions, choices and decisions and behavior. People process information, and we need to understand how they process and how that processing can be facilitated, and how we need to overcome the barriers. Because the image to the right of the man shows us two coexisting images. And again, this is representing the fact that we can sometimes be processing two sets of information at the same time. Climate change and COVID, fear and anxiety, avoidance and approach. We want to socialize, we want to be together, but we're afraid of being infected. And we have to help people understand that they have a choice. Even when images are ambiguous as on the left or confusing as on the right, we need to make choices. Now, how we make those choices is going to very much depend on our core beliefs and our values and attitudes. And in the Caribbean, a very comprehensive and influential core belief has to do with our spiritual beliefs and our faith. In the image to the left at the bottom, we're reminded, this wasn't in the Caribbean, but people prioritize their faith. And when we share information that is counter to their faith and core beliefs, we run into challenges in terms of barriers to uptake. So again, it is a reminder that as we try to design and develop interventions and we talk about partnerships, we need to understand the mindsets that exist. We have to meet people where they are. And some of the values and attitudes and beliefs will be influenced by core beliefs, for example, around religion, but there are other cultural dynamics, racial issues, ethnic issues that we need to understand, especially in the Caribbean region, where in some countries we have significant diversity. When we try to design interventions, we have to begin where people are. And a little humor to the right. In reality, plants are actually farming us by giving us oxygen daily until we all eventually decompose so they can consume us. Just a reminder that we are part of this ecosystem, and what we do unto others will come back to us. So the next slide. That conceptual frame of a pyramid and power and dynamics and priorities really is pervasive in how we look at things. And in fact, very often in mental health and psychosocial services, we have a pyramid where we look at basic services and security at the bottom, then we look at the community and family support, facilitating that, then the focused non-specialized support, and then the specialized support. The idea being that in a disaster, in a crisis, you know, a lot of people need some things, some people need fewer things, smaller group need less, and the small group at the top probably need the most in terms of the type of intervention, but in terms of quantity, there's less. Now, that is how we've looked at mental health and the psychosocial implications of disasters. What is happening with climate change is that we have to shift our focus now and realize that for climate change to be addressed, both in terms of its psychological impact and the impact of our behavior on climate change, our focus needs to be more at the base, at the larger numbers. The well-being of people is important, but the mindsets of the majority is critically important, and resources have to be allocated accordingly. The next slide. So even though we look at our mental health and psychosocial support interventions as moving up in terms of intensity, even though numbers may not be as important, our approach to mental health and psychosocial dimensions of our understanding of climate change needs to change focus. And we need to look more now at the social considerations, the masses of people, the majority. And that means that we have to look at behavior, we have to look at culture. And if we're talking about public health, we have to draw the lessons we've learned from previous interventions, everything from smoking to HIV and AIDS, etc., where we've had a lot of success. And of course, more recently in COVID, with everything from mask wearing to hygiene to social distancing, etc. And running through all of it, of course, are the stigma that have always been associated with certain behaviors and certain interventions that we also have to learn to overcome. Next slide. So challenges, barriers, and opportunities really are critical for us to understand. One of the big concerns we have as psychologists and behavioral scientists is that we don't have enough of evidence and theory-based interventions. We try to address these determinants and these drivers without fully understanding the cultural, social, anthropological, economic, religious, etc., ethnic, racial contexts in which people operate. We design interventions that are too often intuitive or just traditional, and we're not really having a theory of change. We don't have enough work that has been done, and you know that is receiving attention now. And in fact, the Spotlight Initiative in the region is involved with developing a theory of behavior and cultural change, specifically for gender-based violence. But the approach it takes is one that would be applicable for other social and health issues. What is very clear is that if we are going to succeed, we have to be strategic, collaborative, coordinated, and integrated. We have a lot of strengths in the Caribbean. We are creative. We are usually ahead of the game in terms of our ability to engage in interventions and move them quickly. What we have is a challenge of silos. We have a challenge of not having that conceptual theory that allows us to be strategic. And because of the silos, we do not collaborate as well, and we're not coordinated, and therefore we don't integrate. So a lot of the excellent work that is done, whether it is work in terms of psychological first aid and other mental health and psychosocial services, whether it is public education programs and psychoeducational programs, whether it is programs like Return to Happiness, targeting children and in schools. There are a lot of initiatives and collaborations, but our communities of interest and our communities of purpose and our communities of practice are not integrated. There are people who are working at so many different levels who have information that is not being shared, who have lessons learned that are not informing praxis. And unfortunately, we are not therefore getting the return on investment that we need. And it is something that we really have to come to terms with in terms of creating space. And I wanted to highlight a point here. There have been attempts by some agencies to facilitate networking, bringing people together to share and so. What happens, of course, is because too many of us lack an understanding of the behavioral sciences and the science of behavior change and behavior change communication. And so even when we do meet, we don't collaborate in a way that is going to actually increase the impact of our interventions. We share information superficially, but we don't realize that we have to get our messages in sync and coordinated, that our interventions have to be timed, etc. And nowhere is this more clear than in the context of life or lack of attention to life course and developmental approaches. You know, we tend to have a very scattershot approach. So when we're talking about climate change and mental health, what are we messaging to the younger population? How does our message need to change to an adolescent, a young adult, an older population? What do we understand about their perceptions of climate change and mental health? What do we understand about what they need? What do we need to do incrementally integrated into the educational academic system, into the tertiary, into the continuing education, workforce development that will impact the mindsets and maintain an evolution that will continue to keep us ahead of this curve? Because if we're going to manage the dynamics, the psychological dynamics of climate change, we do have to understand that it's going to take a whole society long-term approach. But it has to begin, as I say here, with meeting them where they are. And the them is us as well. Those of us who are involved in research and policy and programs need to understand the complexity of behavior change, and that behavior change and the psychology are critical dimensions of understanding mental health. And healthy minds are the ones that are going to make the right choices that are going to influence the climate and our environment. So, next slide. I use this and I'll just go through it. I use it in my work both as a therapist and as a consultant. Knowledge, we have to make sure we are informed and that we share the right information. Awareness, we need to understand what's happening and we need to help people understand what's happening with them so that we can have insight into cause and effect. And if that happens, if we do the research and collect the data, both at the personal level and at the collective and society level, then the strategies and skills will be more effective. We'll have horses for courses. And of course, any change process requires reprogramming the brain. And to do that, neuroplasticity will only kick in if we have opportunities to practice and change. So our work in public health and our work towards addressing climate change and its impact on mental health has to really be multidimensional. It has to be strategic, coordinated, collaborative, it has to be developmental, and it must be informed by research that is addressing all the intersectionalities that I've only mentioned a few. The final slide. Many of you will have heard this before. The concept crisis is a time of danger and opportunity. Certainly COVID has reminded us most recently of all the dangers and yet of all the opportunities and benefits that have come out of that work. But it's interesting that as Professor Patz said at the beginning, the code red crisis is an opportunity for us to make some changes. I and my colleagues at CARPHA feel a big change should be a better understanding of human behavior and those dynamics, more involvement of the behavioral scientists and the psychologists. But I think the last point I'd want to make is this. Apparently, this quotation from John F. Kennedy was not accurately translated. And it should read that a crisis is a time of danger and choice. And so once again, we get back to this issue of decision-making and choices and how the mind works and how we perceive things and the factors that drive our choices. We are an important part of this. We have to be the advocates, as have been mentioned before. We have to be the ones who facilitate the process. The change begins with us. And CARPHA, the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations, we are doing our work to try to facilitate this as we develop and evolve. And we're available. Please contact us should you need our support or advice or want to partner with us with any of the work that you're doing going forward. Thank you for your attention. and
Thank you. Given the shortage of time, I am going to pose the first question to Jonathan Patz before he has to go. I'm asking for everybody to turn on, we're going to stay in the large group. I'm asking for everybody to turn on their camera so that we could see who you are and we can have the conversation. So let's see. Jonathan, you talked about the impact that we not only have globally, but the impact that we have locally in the area of air pollution. So how do you see the difficulty, and how could you help the Caribbean navigate, how could we help each other navigate the difficulty between the dependence, particularly in some countries of our Caribbean nation, on fossil fuel, and looking at the consequences of environmental pollution and particularly air pollution on the health of the Caribbean nation. So how should Caribbean states really navigate that difficult choice?
Yeah, no, it's not easy, but I think we need to embrace the reality that energy technology is evolving rapidly. And so as far as the economics, it's no longer that much more expensive to use renewables. That said, of course, countries like Trinidad, their economy is a fossil fuel economy. And, this is where, around the world market, the price of oil is going to be fluctuating wildly. It's going to be unreliable. And I think that there are, countries, especially low and middle income countries, that really should be getting investments from the Global Environment Fund and from the international funding agencies to keep the oil in the ground or to preserve forests. So I think the international institutions need to step up to make it easier to transition, but to remain dependent on fossil fuels is a very risky bet now for any country, especially as we're seeing the energy markets changing. And
not only Trinidad and it's not only Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana and Suriname are right behind them in terms of development. And so this is an important issue for the Caribbean to address.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I will have to step out in about a minute. Yeah. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. And we'll continue the conversation in the larger group. And once again, this is our one group breakout. And I would love for you to turn on your camera and put your questions in the chat. Is that what we're doing, Haley?
Yes, please put your questions for our panelists or any comments which you'd like us to discuss in the chat.
Thank you. And that's a very nice transition where we ended to Dr. Willits. Global support has impact on what happens locally. And rightfully so, in your presentation, you really focused on implementation. So where should the Caribbean focus be on the implementation to address, particularly in the area that, as you heard Dr. St. John talk about, food systems and food insecurity?
Thank you so much, Maureen. If I may, I wanted to, could I address your question, but also speak to something that came to mind when Dr. Weller was speaking?
Absolutely.
I'd like to drum up some conversation, if you don't
sure.
mind. So implementation, a focus on implementation, it's a catch-22, which comes first, implementation or the data? And so there needs to be this strong focus on generating the information, not only the hard science, how many cases of malnutrition are associated with food security issues, but also to the social determinants and how the impacts of malnutrition are affecting the other determinants or domestic violence or other elements. Both of these are very important to determining the best fit implementation for each country and how the region responds distinctly from other regions that are facing other kinds of environmental changes. So globally, this missing piece of data is really important. But then how do departments develop the resources to do that and the capacity to do that? Which one comes first? And it comes down to, in the research I've done, it really comes down to finding ways to have the discussions where you can move forward, sharing agendas and sharing resources, because that can be a practical way to move practice towards generating data that's a co-benefit and at the most convenient cost, and having an outcome that can be implemented at scale. And then, of course, many of those conversations will have to involve the arrangements of financial ministries and the priorities. And it really needs to find a way to depart from crisis management and episodic threats and start to think about the long-term health implications. So it's not just, gosh, another hurricane caused this devastation, let's respond to it. It's, well, over time, air pollution or temperature change is going to cause these health impacts, and we need a long-term strategy. I'm going to stop for a second and shift to something that I was inspired by with Dr. Weller's presentation, and actually dials back to my early work on this area. Food is a fascinating domain, and we all play a part in it. No matter if we want to or not, we have to eat. And there's this maybe interconnection between food culture as a driver for the kinds of behavior that we want to have for environmental protection. So kind of food culture as a driver for environmental stewardship. What's going to happen when the degradation of the reefs in the Caribbean start to affect the ability to create some of those amazing seafood curries and other dishes? Could that be something that is used and expanded on, not only to how does that impact mental health? How is that a non-economic loss and a health loss? How does that affect nutrition going forward for the youth if they lose that component? But then also, what can stimulate and mobilize a country to really take steps and change? And maybe I'm going too big here, but I really thought some of the behavior comments were really interesting, and that culture piece maybe could be drawn into the connection with food.
So that's a really excellent transition into Dr. Weller's question I had. So Dr. Weller, you pointed out a number of things, and in addition to the culture, and I really invite you to comment on Dr. Willitz's comments on and question on the provoking question on the culture, but also you were pointing out that implementation and the cumulative impact of disasters and climate change on top of that requires us to make choices and requires us to break down silos so that we work in a transdisciplinary way. And that actually also links with Dr. Ora's question in the chat. So how do we prepare the future professionals in a transdisciplinary fashion to address the mental health impacts of climate change? So in a way, 3 questions in one. Dr. Weller.
Okay, yeah, it's a big story, you know, and I think, so let me make some quick responses. First to Liz, yes, culture is critical, and if we understand it better, we can understand how to motivate and drive behavior, and we understand how to make links. I'll make a quick comment there. The Caribbean is very faith-based. Faith beliefs are big drivers and managers. We need to, you know, if we talk about engaging with faith-based partners, it's not just about having them have health fairs, etc., etc. It's about also helping them unpack what their religious books say about issues that can either be facilitators or barriers of this change process. And it's therefore not only the faith-based, the pastor or the imam who needs to be the messenger, but the other messengers need to reference the relevant faith beliefs and integrate them into those messages. So you talk about food and culture and what's important, and I'm just highlighting the dynamics of faith. And I think that also speaks to how we can break down some of the silos that were mentioned. There were 3 questions. The support for the climate change educators and activists, and the general mitigation. Okay. I think that brings me to a point that I really did not make enough of in my presentation, which is across all these silos and these complexity is autonomy and independence, efficacy, and self-care. No matter which area we're working in, we have to help people understand how to take care of themselves, whether it is because of the climate or the COVID or the challenges of the violence in their society. And this is true of us as educators and providers and activists. We also have to understand ourselves, what is being triggered, what our automatic thoughts are, what our automatic coping, which might be healthy or unhealthy. And we need to take care of the caregivers, but we also need to take care of ourselves. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is that one of the areas that we need to do more work in is promoting self-care, promoting the skills and the strategies that are required for taking care of yourself. That's for the general public. So for those of us who are the caregivers, the policy, the activists, we need to understand how to take care of ourselves as well. And we need to understand why we're getting depressed, because what might depress me about the climate may not be what is depressing Liz or Haley. And I think that we need to do that work, because if the head of the stream is not healthy, then further down the stream, you're not going to get health. This is true for us as advocates and activists, but it's also true for those who are the policymakers and the leaders and the influentials in society. So again, it's another group that we need to target. I think I have touched on a number of things that I think are important in terms of mitigating against the negative impacts of climate. So we're talking about the research and the data, we're talking about using the culture, we're talking about also moving from a top-down hierarchical approach to promoting self-care and wellness, but in a way that is relevant to people so that they feel they can do it. And finally, we also have to be realistic about the kinds of programs that we try to implement. I was in a forum last week in which a particular initiative was being discussed, and it was very clear that people are being asked to implement programs designed by large organizations that they don't have the resources to do. They don't have the resources to do, and very often as an individual, they're not in a position to advocate or influence the powers that be to allocate the resources to do it. And I think that causes a lot of the burnout and depression also. So again, we need to be very, we know about SMART objectives having to be realistic, but I think sometimes, urgency to deal with a crisis or anxiety to solve the problem, we forget that lower down in the system, people need to have the resources to do the work, or else it doesn't get done or gets done badly and has a negative rather than a positive effect. Clearly, I could talk for a long time about this, so I will stop and give space to others.
Go on about this topic for quite a while, but I'm very mindful and back on track. I had 3 questions for the group, and that linked to Dr. Abdul Wahid's question to Dr. Weller as well. So the first one was what are the key challenges? And clearly the 3 presentations identified those key challenges. The second one was what are the key barriers? And each of the 3 speakers this morning identified some of the key barriers. But what we didn't touch on, and in the last 3 minutes or so, is I'd like to hear from everyone, particularly in the Caribbean, and building on what Dr. Weller indicated, that we have to implement our own, adapt and tailor our own, can use national and international and global examples, but where, Dr. Willett was bringing us as well. And so what are the assets in the Caribbean region to address the challenges of air pollution, food insecurity, and mental health? What are the assets we can build on, and how could we make this collaborative for anyone? I'm asking our Caribbean partners here for anyone to address us. So what is it? How rich are we? Whether it's culturally, data-wise, or through organizations such as CARPHA and CARICOM, where are we to, and what is it that we have to begin to address the challenges in each of the three areas? That brings us later to the research agenda and practice and policy agenda too. But I'd like to hear from our Caribbean colleagues, and I'm really sad to look at blank screens or black squares rather than seeing real happy faces, the ones I so miss by being here and not being in the Caribbean. And so some answers, please, some thoughts. Otherwise, I'm known to do some arm twisting and public shaming. So Rosa and Truce, please, and Farshanda,
Okay.
and Steve, and just
Okay.
give me some key assets that we have.
Okay. Can I say something? Did you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I turn off the camera because I'm in the office, and every time you have people coming in the office, so that's why. Okay, I'm from the meteorological office. I know there are participants from the Ministry of Health. I hope so. I'm with the Met Office for a couple of years, and I'm retired already, but they asked me to help the meteorological office now for a year. And what I realized is that there is I won't say there is no collaboration, but collaboration with the Ministry of Health, and in this case, the meteorological office, that's important because you need data to do your research. I know we have a national adaptation plan, and in the national adaptation plan, there is also a paragraph on health, on agriculture, but that is what I know, what I have at this moment about this. I mean, I would like to help, I would like to work with, in this case, the Ministry of Public Works, when you have to do it with data, sharing the data.
And so what you're saying is the asset might be a plan, but the challenge is to implement that plan in a collaborative fashion. I see Steve has his hands up. Steve?
That's just my opinion, but
and probably Suriname is not
okay,
the only country facing that. So,
to the other.
Yeah, thank you. Through Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lidveld. And thanks for putting me on the spot by calling me out. But in the information that's provided here is all very technical and correct. However, the main challenge and this is based on my experiences, to move towards implementation, even as it relates to using the assets you have to understand the cultural and context of the Caribbean. And many things to be successfully implemented requires political will and political partnerships. So for instance, if you're speaking of mental health, if you're speaking of food security and food safety, There are departments within the government for each of these, which are assets, and they have the data, they do the work. As it relates to bringing it into the mainstream of climate change under one unified objective, it requires political awareness, first of all, and political commitment. And I sometimes feel like I'm a stuck record because I can only speak of how I know things are done. We need to have political involvement with respect to the climate change agenda. And that is my experience. In the past, we had the conference in 2017, which was the strategic plan for climate and health, where we had ministers of health coming together in a conference, and they would have been signatory to many important decisions for climate change decision making. I thought that was a very good start because it brought about the awareness and the level of commitments with clear benchmarks to be achieved were outlined. And I remember ministers of health that were there were very excited and pumped about what was happening. Unfortunately, COVID came along and it derailed much of that, what was intended there. And I feel strange actually repeating this all the time because it seems like if this is the only thing I have to say, but I am speaking about what actually works. And I do think that despite all the assets we have in terms of the departments with the data availability and the resources, the work needs to be focused based on the political directives, because that is literally how things get done and how things are implemented in the Caribbean.
Thank you. And Steve, where are you from?
I'm from Barbados.
Barbados. Thank you. So Kim Newton has her hand up, and then Liz wanted to add about assets. So Kim, please. And Kim, where are you from?
Okay, I'm from St. Lucia, and I am part of the CARPHA team, EHSD, based in Environmental Health and Sustainable Development Department, based in St. Lucia. For me, and just listening to some of the presentations, one of the assets that I think we have in the Caribbean is this sort of increase in the sort of training programs that we see. And I can speak to a training program that I've been part of, and I see Steve just went, he was part of that program, and Chris Ora, the coordinator of the Climate Change and Health Fellowship Program. And the aim was to help create leaders in climate change that would, from different sectors in government and different areas, that would help push this sort of climate change and health agenda in different sectors. Not only, and for me, this helps to reduce this sort of silo sort of thinking and help, different sectors make that link between, climate change and food safety, climate change and mental health, because I still think one of the big problems that we have that encourages this sort of silos is the understanding of that link and making these sort of connections, not only at the governmental level, but also the community level, the youth level, because when we can clearly see these sort of links, then we see the benefit of getting away from this sort of silo sort of, behaviors. Yeah, so that's my contribution. Hi, Steve and Chris.
Thank you, Kim. It sounds like we all need to bring our shovels together and start breaking some silos. Sabrina, thank you for indicating that data are lacking, but the strength that we're seeing is that community support and the cultural assets. So very much the same thing that Dr. Abdul Wahid was talking about. So I'm taking the prerogative as the moderator and not giving you a break. And so that gives us a few more minutes before we go into the next session. Liz, you wanted to add?
Sure, thank you. And maybe I should apologize to bring things back to the technical data level, but I think one other point that I have noticed at the global level is not just the lack of data, but the not connecting the dots. And in some ways that there are assets to be strengthened or to be recognized in the sense that what Steve was saying, departments have data, they have knowledge, they have enthusiasm, and that cultural value. But how do we connect the dots? And I wanted to provide one example that I really found very interesting. I work as a consultant for IISD, but I also work as a consultant for WHO. And we are about to produce a new publication that reviews the IPCC report that just came out, the AR6. It's the 2022. They produce these reports every half decade. So we really took a view of the impacts on vulnerability and various aspects of climate change on health. So one thing that came to light in this work is the missing connection between the conversation that starts, climate change is going to impact fish stocks. That's going to affect health. But then there's a missing jump. And there's the jump to, well, what is that going to do for the protein, the calories, the cultural component of that food, and what the value of that food is to the community? That jump is missing worldwide. There's not that value that the health community can bring to that conversation is missing. And it's not necessarily that it doesn't exist and we don't have that asset of data, but it's that those dots haven't been connected and haven't been invited to be connected. And that could be a really interesting way to take things forward. For example, if another conference on climate change and health were to take place in the Caribbean, to really look at connecting those dots and bringing that data together.
Okay, and in the last 2 minutes, I want to, give Dr. Weller one more chance to comment, but also give a heads up to Farshanda, because after Dr. Aura presents, I'm going to ask her as a medical student and future physician to talk about how we integrate climate and health education into the medical school. Dr. Weller.
Thank you. I'm going to sound like Steve and be a one-note samba kind of person, but it's about understanding human behavior. It's understanding what makes people choose the things they do, whether it's politicians and leaders who need to understand that collaboration is more than putting people together in a room. We need to help them understand behavior and behavior change. And in terms of just general change, I think one of the things that we are missing is that we know why people should behave the way we want them to. We don't understand why they would. And I'm highlighting what I think is a significant difference. Why would somebody pay attention to climate change when they're afraid of COVID, when they're not earning any money, when they can't pay their rent, when they are victims of crime in their community? Why would they pay attention? If we can begin to understand where people are and why they would do something, then we can then facilitate that change process. And I think that's where our research and our implementation really needs to focus, understanding what would make people behave the way we know they should, because we have certain expertise and insights. And I'm hoping that collaboratively we can begin to look at that dimension of implementation.
And we'll come back to that, but that is a very good point. What our priority is might not be another person's priority. And so we're going back into presentation mode. And it is now my honor to introduce a great colleague who time and time again says yes when I ask him to join us and share with us what the Pan American Health Organization is doing all over in the Caribbean. Dr. Daniel Booth is a biologist with a PhD in public health. He has extensive experience as a senior researcher, first in Fiocruz, in the Brazilian Ministry of Health, particularly in the area of environmental monitoring and management, in public and environmental health, and most importantly, and that links to our last piece of the conversation, in citizen science. Since 2016, he's been the advisor for climate change and health for the Pan American Health Organization based in DC, in Washington, DC. And as part of his portfolio, he manages the agendas of biodiversity, green spaces, and their effect on human health. Dr. Booth today will talk about the national adaptation plans, the focus in the Caribbean on vulnerability and adaptation assessments, and some progress and the challenges that we face, but some really exciting progress that we're making in the Caribbean. Dr. Booth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maureen Lichtveld, our friend from a long time. Also, Cecilia Sorensen, our colleague from Columbia University. On behalf of CARPHA, I would like to also to acknowledge Dr. Joyce and John, also a long-term colleague from PAHO. Country representatives, CMOs, environmental health officers, colleagues from WHO, and all people attending today. I'm just switching here to my to presentation mode. And thanks so much once again for having me here. Hopefully you can see my screen, Maureen. Yeah. So just
yes, we can, and we can hear you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So just to start, so I'll just give some updates on the implementation of the climate change and health agenda in the Caribbean. As you know, here in Washington, D.C., we do work with all the countries and territories in the Americas, including Central America, South America, but also specifically for this presentation, we will address the subregion of the Caribbean, where, and Dr. Steve Daniel also already addressed that topic, the Caribbean Action Plan on Health and Climate Change, which we would use as a starting point, because we also recognize that this was a major achievement for the Caribbean region. So in the end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, we developed with Ministers of Health, Environment, and Climate Change of Caribbean countries and territories this plan, which has and outlines actions to be taken and agreed by countries at the national level, regional level, and having indicators to measure the success of its implementation. And it's structured around four main pillars, one being empowerment. So we heard today already in previous presentations the importance of raising the profile of health leaderships and engaging health in interministerial committees on climate change to make sure that the voices and concerns and issues from the health sector are being heard and are being incorporated into the planning part, the planning and strategic planning of countries, including the NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans, the Nationally Determined Contributions, the NDCs, and all the other plans that countries take. And for that, it was a very interesting session that we just had, which was kind of discussing, and this was addressing that on what is more important or where we are in terms of gathering data versus supporting implementation or being ready to start implementation. And I think that the conclusion is doing both, but we cannot just focus on building evidence alone without also focusing on implementing what we already know. And in the Caribbean region, given the capacity and given what we heard from previous presentations and what we've been following with countries, there's a lot of capacity in the Caribbean. There's a lot of good information in the Caribbean. So we can dream of already start moving towards implementation. I think that finding the right balance between still having to gather evidence and build the strategies and plans, but also on the things that we already know and we already have enough information, we can already start moving on implementation is the key thing for the success of any planned actions in the Caribbean. And the last pillar in this proposal is on bringing resources to support specifically actions on health and climate change, not just to build evidence, but also to start making implementation and to allow health and other ministries to work together with regards to the topics related to climate change. So I'll start with the last point on building resources. We were able to, and with multi-partners, including CARPHA, with CARICOM structures and CARI Forum, to prepare and have approved two large proposals on climate change and health in the Caribbean, one of them being the European Union CARPHA project, which addresses all 16 Caribbean countries. Starting in 2020, as also Steve Daniel was mentioning, just when the pandemic hit, so that kind of moved a little bit of what we were planning from the beginning, but we are still pursuing the implementation of that, and we are seeing some progress. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what's been going on with that project. But also we had approved for the first time in the world, so this is unique project in the world, on a readiness proposal approved by the Green Climate Fund that had health as the main topic. So we did prepare this proposal with the 7 countries that are listed there, and we start implementation this month until 2024 with countries. And a little bit of the flavor of what's going on in these 2 projects. And I invite you to visit this webpage on the Strengthening Climate Resilient Health Systems in the Caribbean. It's the European Union CARPHA project that is ongoing already. And I'm going to talk to you specifically on 4 main bullets, although we do have a lot of other actions that I invite you to take a look at the webpage that was built for this project. One of them being the health chapters in National Adaptation Plan, so where we are with this implementation. And it's also a lot of gathering information and evidence, using tools to estimate health co-benefits of mitigation policies and interventions. Third point being improving surveillance capacity and linking health surveillance with other information systems like meteorological systems, environmental information, and social demographic information to start building the risk maps and exposure routes, and then connecting all that in terms of building early warning systems for climate-related diseases and health conditions. And the last point being building climate change leadership, as we've spoken. And maybe the 2 main things of the GCF Readiness Project that is starting this month is to estimate greenhouse gas emissions from healthcare facilities and collect baseline data to prepare a portfolio of projects on health and climate change for future investments. This component is also somehow displayed in the EU CARPHA project, but it's more visible in the GCF Readiness proposal. Now, going a little bit on the results that we had so far. So as the Health National Adaptation Plans that we call HNAPs as an acronym, the Health National Adaptation Plans should provide a diagnostic of health systems vulnerabilities, strengths, and also opportunities for action, not just within. So when we talk about health systems, we take into consideration everything that health sector is managing, but also health determining sectors. And the second main topic, main point for the HNAPs is to build and list the actions that will address health impacts of climate change, and that the HNAP should not be detached from the whole National Adaptation Plan process. Some countries are doing SASAPs or sectoral actions, so some countries are calling that differently, but in a given sense, they all address the same idea of building national adaptation plans. So the Green Climate Fund and many other donors, they use those plans. This is one of the main importance of those national adaptation plans, is that Green Climate Fund and other donors also use those plans to map the priorities for investments, and then they stimulate that becomes part of the country investment programming that usually Ministry of Planning or Ministers of Finance are developing for countries. And we at CARPHA WHO, we have developed a number of materials that are available. I invite you to take a look if you want. We will make this presentation available with the links for all that. So to how to draft vulnerability and adaptation assessments, which is more the kind of diagnostic of health system vulnerabilities and opportunities, how to create the HNAPs, linking that with the whole NAP process in the country and how to include health considerations into nationally determined contributions. Just to give you some examples. And on the HNAP development, we already provided training to all 16 Caribbean countries, and we hired consultants, and work is ongoing in a number of them. Cuba already completed their national adaptation plan a few years ago. Now they're willing to prepare a new document. We had already advanced with Grenada and St. Lucia with the national consultations and are already prepared drafts of the HNAPs, which is being now analyzed for clearance by the country. And we have ongoing work at different stages with Bahamas, Belize, Haiti, and Jamaica. And now we are starting this process of hiring consultants and triggering the national consultations in Barbados, Guyana, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and Dominican Republic. We are creating this regional knowledge sharing platform on HNAPs, so to share the best practices, to build some consensus around standardization methods, also mobilizing technical and other resources that are needed for the countries. But that should serve well, you know, for space for countries to share experiences. And I invite you also to take a look at the PAHO WHO UNFCCC country profiles on health and climate change that we have prepared already for 9 countries in the Caribbean, because they have some elements that we will later feed into the whole HNAP and VNA development plans. We also have a line of work on adapting and piloting the PAHO WHO tools to estimate the health benefits on mitigation policies and interventions on air quality, green spaces, and active transportation. So countries that are interested in creating those policies, or at least estimating the co-benefits they can get if they implement some of those policies, we have those tools which are GIS based at the city level, potentially even at the country level, given some the context of some Caribbean islands, and they can estimate the avoided costs on health of taking action in those 3 aspects: air quality, green spaces, and active transportation. We already started with the work in all these countries that are listed in the bottom about the AirQ Plus, which is one of the tools to measure or to estimate the health benefits from improving air quality. But we are now receiving letters of interest from countries to start training and using these tools, these other tools that are mentioned in this slide for the countries who are interested. And also we are strengthening our quality monitoring networks. So one example was in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Barbados, due to the La Soufrière volcano, that we strengthened air quality monitoring networks there to understand the effects of air quality to human health because of that particular event, but also to measure Saharan dust and other air contaminants, and to draft recommendations to address health impacts in those countries. Moving to improving surveillance capacity and building integrated assessment tools, we have an ongoing work with developing early warning systems, also with CARPHA and many other agencies like CIMH and others, to prepare these early warning systems for climate-sensitive diseases and health conditions. And we are starting this process in Grenada, St. Lucia, and Kitts and Nevis. It's an interesting approach that we are taking, and with the information that is available and the main priorities defined by countries, we are developing these early warning systems with them. It's still at early stages, but we are seeing with very good eyes that this could become something to be expanded to other countries in the Caribbean as well. And also CARPHA, PAHO, and CIMH, we do have every 3 months this Caribbean Health Climatic Bulletin that we are trying to update now to include new information that is available at the Caribbean level. On training, we do have a climate resilient water and sanitation plans. So we are including the climate resilience part to the traditional water and sanitation plans that are being prepared by countries. And on food safety, we are working with CARPHA and others on preparing these multi-sectoral surveillance of emerging food safety risks in Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Barbados. And we are starting the same process in other countries soon. So that's another area that we are supporting with this project of EU CARIFORUM grants. To finish my presentation, just to address some of the health leadership, just to use it as a good segue to our friend Prizura, who is going to talk a little bit on these the cohorts on the fellowship programs with University of West Indies. So our first cohort just ended. Now we are starting a new one. And there's also the CARICOM Youth Ambassadors on Climate and Health, which the second cohort will commence shortly, which is a very good idea to really make sure that these topics are not just being addressed today, but that we are preparing also the next generations to keep on going with the good work. In this last slide, I just wanted to mention that we do have a new colleague from the Caribbean joining our team here in Washington, DC, Karen Paulson, she's online. Also, Adriana Thomas, who is the responsible officer for the implementation of the EU CARIFORUM project. She's in Guyana, but working with our office in Barbados. So I invite you to, if you have any questions, comments, just sending us some emails, some questions, and we will be delighted to continue discussing this topic with all of you. So thank you very much for the time and the opportunity, Maureen, and I pass the mic back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. And I know there is so much. I knew there was progress, but I'm truly impressed with the progress. And looking forward to, in the question and answer session, talk more about the tools that have been developed as part and with your leadership. And it's great to hear that Karen is joining you in DC. So our next presenter is Dr. James Schultz. Dr. Schultz comes to us from, has a PhD in behavioral epidemiology from the University of Minnesota. He joined the Department of Epi and Public Health of the University of Miami, left and came back to do some very important disaster management work as part of the Center for Disaster and Extreme Event Preparedness. As part of that center, he led over 500 full-day disaster behavioral health trainings. And I am glad that he's here to address something that is very close personally to me, and that's the forced migration that's happening in so many populations and so many communities related to climate change. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Schultz.
So Dr. Lichtfeld, thank you so much for the introduction. I've actually just come up to my office from the classroom. So it looks like we have 28 people online, but in my classroom, we've got another 30. So actually our session right now has about twice the number that you see there. And the purple G there is my TA, and in the classroom, another 30 people are watching. So welcome to all, and I have screen sharing permission. So let me talk to you rapidly, because we have only a short period for this, about environmental migration and health in the Caribbean. So just as a quick wrap up, as you well know, climate is changing, and the different futures that lie ahead depend on how rapidly that change takes place. We certainly know that climate has been changing since the Industrial Revolution, but accelerating in recent decades. And we're seeing a rise in global temperatures that has been so dramatic that the last 7 years, 2015 to 2021, have been the warmest on record. These are things you know, but certainly for the Caribbean, as we have more hot weather and more extreme hot weather, this especially impacts the beltline around the globe. Climate change is producing anthropogenic climate drivers. You see here the northern loop current, which is the warmest portion of the Atlantic and the Caribbean at this very moment. And we're seeing climate drivers, including anomalously warm ocean temperatures. And these are warm temperatures down deep. So we have rising ocean heat content, which powers hurricanes and heat waves. We also have very warm air temperatures, which increases atmospheric moisture content, leading to extreme precipitation. And that's mounted on sea level rise. And we certainly know that climate change is changing hurricane hazards. So we're seeing higher peak wind speeds, very rapid and multiple successive rapid intensifications. We're seeing higher storm surges, deluging rains, not only coastal seawater flooding, but inland freshwater flooding. And of course, there is a great deal of heat, and that is heat throughout the area. But in the aftermath of hurricanes, when power goes out, that is exposure to heat and humidity for weeks and months afterwards. Going back to 2017, this is a picture of Hurricane Irma going through the northern leewards. And what we find with these climate-driven hurricanes, they are stronger. For example, more rapid peak wind speeds, they are wetter. But one of the characteristics is they tend to slow down when they come over populated coastlines. And they also remain intact longer. If you don't watch closely, you won't see that I'm now about to go click. And now we're looking at Hurricane Maria, which actually came along in 2017, several weeks later. And as you see here with the eye wall coming in the southeast coast, bisected Puerto Rico. And this is the path that Maria took as it went across the island. Now, in the aftermath, I've been asked also to talk about some of the health consequences. In the limited time, I'll talk about health consequences after hurricanes. There were officially 64 impact phase deaths, but far more post-impact deaths that we'll talk about in a moment. Physical injury, heat-related injury, particularly impressive chronic disease exacerbation, vector and waterborne diseases, exposure to environmental hazards, psychological distress was widespread, as was diagnosable psychopathology. There was damage to infrastructure with island-wide power outages, and some of these lasted up to 6 months. In the aftermath, exposure to heat, leading to heat stress, exhaustion, heat stroke. Cell towers were destroyed, disruption of communications, no internet, water contamination, extreme water shortage. When the Milken Institute of Public Health at George Washington was commissioned to do a study of excess mortality out to 5 months at the end of March 2018, from the 20th of September 2017, when Maria went across Puerto Rico, they estimated about 3,000 excess deaths. So environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who, predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment, are obliged to leave their habitual homes and who move either within their country or abroad. So looking at what happened in the 2017 hurricane season in the Caribbean, we found 3 million people who were displaced, about a third in the US, but 2/3 in the Caribbean, the largest number being in Cuba. And this is displacement inside the boundaries of the country, inside the boundaries of the island state. And so we had a massive amount of displacement that took place. And when we talk about climate-induced migration, including distress displacement, or climate migration for short, this can be attributed largely to the slow onset impacts of climate change on livelihoods owing to shifts in water availability and crop productivity, but particularly germane to the Caribbean, also due to sea level rise or storm surge. Now, going back to the document I just showed you, you can see the amount of displacement island by island throughout the Caribbean from that trifecta of Harvey, Irma, and Maria in 2017. One of the key points to think about is that environmental mobility is now the preferred and overarching term. And you'll see that environmental mobility includes migration, but when it goes across borders, it also involves displacement. And in a number of island nations, we're seeing this in the South Pacific, not just the Caribbean, there will be increasing aspects of planned adaptive relocation, where people seek communities that are more sustainable and that will actually support life and livelihood. But also very critical to understand is the dimension to the right, which is there may be immobility. In many cases, the worst of the worst is the situation where people are trapped in involuntary immobility and they simply cannot vacate or move or evacuate away from climate hazards. Right now, almost 4% of the global population involves millions of migrants, and that comes from various sources, conflict, and climate among them. When we look at the World Migration Report 2022, you see that there are many inputs that actually set these people in motion. And mobility drivers on the far right side include people who are on the move due to food, water, economic, personal energy, and global environmental insecurity that moves them in the direction of seeking other places to live. More recently, we've experienced Hurricane Dorian. Hurricane Dorian was the strongest storm ever to hit the Bahamas, as you well know. And here you actually can see it winding up to 185-mile-an-hour winds. I'm circling right here this arrowhead, which is actually a portion of Marsh Harbor, the capital of the Abacos Islands. So looking here, you can actually see that the very center of the storm passed directly over Marsh Harbor, and about 5,000 to 10,000 residents of Marsh Harbor were inside the eye for periods of 2 hours or more. That actually caused us to write an article, Scrambling for Safety in the Eye of Dorian, Mental Health Consequences of Exposure to a Climate-Driven Storm. Now, we had also written with the Minister of Health at the time, this article in New England Journal on double environmental injustice, climate change, Hurricane Dorian, and the Bahamas. Injustice number one, the Bahamas and the small island states of the Caribbean do not contribute or contribute only negligibly to greenhouse gases. But injustice number two is even within island states, the poorest of the poor experience the worst of the worst. So this is the destruction of the shanty towns of the mud and pigeon peas in Marsh Harbor, inhabited by non-resident, migrant, Haitian, and other nationality workers who were in ramshackle dwellings to start with, utterly destroyed by Hurricane Dorian, and many individuals were swept out to sea and never found again. Storm surge up to 7 meters, official mortality 70, but hundreds not found, and about 10,000 persons dispersed and displaced to other Bahamas islands, many because of COVID, still displaced. I was about to end here, but I just grabbed one more screen shot, and this is this morning. This is actually the forecast from National Hurricane Center as of this morning, and the trajectory of this 70% probability storm, which would probably be named Fiona, is coming in a direction basically very similar to what happened in these previous storms. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz. We will continue on before we go into questions, and I really appreciate the differences you made in the terminology, because that matters to people, but we'll come back to that. It's now my honor to introduce another colleague from the Caribbean, Dr. Chris Ora, who is a professor in veterinary virology at the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. Veterinary surgeon with a PhD in viral immunopathology and many years of research, predominantly in vector-borne and protozoal diseases. But Chris is here with us, working in many countries, including Mexico, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. But he's here with us to focus on the notion of One Health and how we train students to be able to address climate change in the future. And in general, health professionals who are already in the workforce, but also who will be the health professionals of the future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Ora.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking for my few minutes on training Caribbean health professionals to tackle the climate crisis. And really answering why do we need to do this? I think we all know that. What are the programs and initiatives that are out there, as we have quite a few, and how we maximize the learning opportunities, including face-to-face and online. So we all know about the problem, and I won't go into that in any more detail because we've heard about it today. We have major problems with our health systems, and our populations are extremely vulnerable in the Caribbean. So it's clear we desperately need leaders in climate change and health to be empowered so they can actually support the change process going forward. So what's our solution? We need to develop and implement training programs targeted at health professionals. And that includes both in the universities, as we'll hear from our next speaker, but also critically in the workforce, those people that are actually at the forefront, who have the ear of the personal, of the permanent secretary and the minister, who are really in a position to affect change in our different ministries. We need to develop these cohorts and networks of climate change and health practitioners and give them the knowledge and skills to become agents of change. And in so doing, promote an interdisciplinary, intersectoral One Health approach, getting out of those silos, really taking into consideration the importance of nature and the environment. And as we heard earlier, including the linkages to the determinants of health. And that's not only the social, but also the cultural, political, economic, commercial, and environmental. So what are the current programs and initiatives that we have available? And as Kim said earlier, there are quite a few. We have, many of us would have been involved recently with the Caribbean Climate and Health Responders course, coordinated by EarthMedic, Columbia, and CMIH. We have, and I'll talk a little bit about the UE Climate Change and Health Fellowship Program, which Kim mentioned earlier. Also the Yale Climate Change and Health Certificate course. As Daniel mentioned, also the CARICOM Youth Ambassadors Program, and also the Global Consortium of Climate and Health Education, which is supporting the integration of climate and health into tertiary, especially medical curricula. So I'm not going to talk very much because I only have 7 minutes about these different areas, but many of you would have been involved with the Caribbean Climate and Health Responders course. And as we can see, there's a real need for this because there were over 1,200 registrants. And there was 10 lectures and 5 practical skills sessions. And when we run these kind of courses, we really need to think about all the time about sustainability. How are we going to keep the process going forward? And in this, to this effect, 2 working groups have been developed from this responders course, and there's a monthly webinar workshop series is being implemented. And the first 6 months will focus on the critical area of climate change and NCDs, non-communicable diseases. And you can read more about this, so you'll have my slides on the link below. I'm an alumni of the Yale School of Public Health Climate Change and Health Certificate course. It's an excellent course with 6-week modules: Introduction to Climate Change and Health, Climate Adaptation and Human Health, and Communicating Climate Change and Health, which is very important. And the Yale guys have been in touch with us about bringing in a module specifically focused on the Caribbean in future years. And this is a series of lectures, discussion boards, reading activities, and critically small group discussions. And this is a really excellent course. And of course, what Kim mentioned earlier, the course that I'm leading at the moment, the fellowship that I'm leading, the Climate Change and Health Leaders Fellowship Program, which we're now on our 2nd cohort. And this is a part-time 12-month blended learning curriculum directed program, where we're really focusing on early to mid-career professionals, as I said, within that sphere where they can really affect change. So we have a workshop at the start and a workshop at the end, and we have themed online sessions in key areas throughout the year. But critically, in a learning by doing approach, the fellows also implement nationally relevant climate change and health projects. They also develop their networks in their home countries by running a workshop and symposium, and are able to spend a week in a CARICOM climate change regional agency where they can really deep dive into an area that is of special interest to them. Also, there's the Global Consortium for Climate and Health Education, which is, as you can see, a consortium involving many countries around the world. And they really have a very exciting set of resources for health education. I think our next speaker will talk a bit about this because it's more focused on the medical health sector, really being able to access slide decks and problem-based learning cases and learning objectives, which will really help us to do what we all really need to do, is bring climate change and health into our tertiary education system, not only in the medical sector, but in other health sectors, but all sectors of tertiary education. And we must also remember we need to bring it into our primary school and our secondary school education. So you can see more about this on the link below. And I'd just like to finish by talking about some of the reflections that I've put together over the years when I've been trying to build, or we've been building networks of climate change professionals. And we really need to constantly think, how can we maximize the learning opportunities along the way? Because certainly in the case of the fellowship, we have experienced, knowledgeable, very busy, stressed adult learners with little time. And as I said earlier in my question to Dr. Weller, the subject is extremely depressing. So we have to keep it upbeat and make the learning fun, but also useful. And we have to enable the fellows and the trainees to build relationships and friendships so they can work with each other in this really, really difficult subject that we're all trying to get across. We run an adaptively managed curriculum, so this is modified based on what the fellows bring to the program, what they need from the program. But we also bring in local and regional experts, so experiences are grounded in local realities within the Caribbean, so they can really relate to those realities and tie the learning to tangible real-world issues relevant against the learners in the Caribbean. So they'll be solving real problems through their national projects and taking what they've learned in the sessions and applying it to their national projects. So really maximizing opportunity for practicing what's been learned, and also opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and also learning through shared experiences. And my final slide, also, when you're doing any of this training program, we have to tailor the programs according to the trainees, of course, and we have to constantly think about what we need, how we can do better, how we can do a better job. So we have to think of, do the competencies and attributes that we cultivate in the trainees or the fellows translate into positive change? Is what we're giving them actually enabling them to go out there and action and make change? And if not, what can we do? And also, critically, what is the appropriate intensity, frequency, and longevity of the training? This might be different for different groups and might need to be tailored. Also, just to finish off, it was mentioned by one of the speakers earlier, we need to cultivate collective leadership that results in systems change. Climate change is a wicked, complex problem that requires a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach. We need to get out of our silos. If one wheel in the cog stops, everything stops. So we need to look at collective leadership across the system and how we develop that when we're looking into this. And that is more of a challenge. It's not just standard leadership training. This is more collective leadership training, specifically for this very, very wicked, complex problem that we're talking about. And finally, how do we conduct this training more effectively online? We've learned a lot from COVID-19. We need to continue learning and apply this so we can have more online learning and reduce our carbon footprint and not to fly everybody around the world. Thank you very much. Just like to finish by saying, if you're interested in applying for the third cohort of Climate Change and Health Fellowship Program, please do. It's open in November 2022, and you can see more information on the links below. Over to you, Maureen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And this was truly a portfolio that is ripe for the use and ripe for the taking. So let me start with the questions that I had. And asking again all of our the audience to join us so where we could see each other, and then move into audience specific questions. So Daniel, how can we engage, or how is PAHO helping to engage the other states in the Caribbean beyond the 9 that have developed such useful, it seems, and excellent tools?
Thank you, Maureen. No, the tools are being offered to all countries, all Caribbean countries. And the way that we are moving with that is by receiving letters of interest from countries. So countries are expressing interest in the tools as they think that those are the priorities. We also do some feasibility analysis, if you will, to see if countries are ready also to start implementing the actions, right, on green spaces or air quality or active transportation, or even the climate resilient health, water and safety plans and the food systems analysis that we are doing, or the early warning systems on climate sensitive diseases. So what we are doing, the approach that we are taking with these projects is to offer all these things that we mentioned and some more tools that we have available, and see countries react as expression of interests. And then we engage with each of these countries to see how ready or how far they are from being able to implement those policies or to do the interventions. And then we recommend them to take one of the few steps, either preparatory or if they are ready to start implementing all these tools. So that's a good approach, we think, because also we are always collecting countries' priorities and data from countries on how far they are from implementing these tools and ideas. So it's a constant dialogue with countries that allow us to also to offer what is already available for countries that they can start implementing ASAP, or that we need some previous training to get them ready to do the implementation. But we are moving with this process in many tracks, as you can imagine. So each countries are receiving the products that they are ready to start implementing. And some of them are receiving preparatory trainings so they can start jumping on the train as soon as they're ready to implement some of these ideas.
So in anticipation of this workshop, I know we've talked about the presidents having come together and their commitment that they made to invest in climate change. I can also imagine that it could be overwhelming for a country who doesn't necessarily have the cadre, and that goes back to Chris's work, have the cadre to implement that. So do countries then work with you as part of the feasibility centers, or how do they work with you as part of the feasibility assessment to identify what priority, which tool they can use for their priority?
So what we do is to have constant dialogues with them, like I said, and to understand what are the information that they do have available and the capacities that they do have available. And we try to match that information with what we hear from high political levels on what are their priorities as part of the PAHO cooperation with countries, and as part of what's been offered with the EU CARPHA project. So we do have a steering committee that all countries are participants, but we also have specific working groups to measure the progress of the HNAP implementation, the tools implementations, the communication strategy implementation. So we do have at the highest level people participating in the steering committee for the whole proposal, and we do have in each of these working groups technical people from countries who will be responding to the practical implementation of each of these tools. So we do have this multi-level way to hear countries and also to offer countries back what we think that they are ready to receive, and in dialogue with them to decide what the country are interested and how we can facilitate that to them.
Thank you. I'll come back to that when we make that connection with Chris. But Dr. Schultz, thank you for having your students participate. That's really great. I am to repeat Dr. Weller's previous point on what we call what. And so I'm working with indigenous communities, and terminology really matters in the relationship to culture. So whether we call it migration or dislocation or displacement or the immobility or forced migration really matters, because the pride that communities have even in the context of the lack of ability to take action. So I would really appreciate your reflecting on the terms, as I'm sure you do for your students, but our Caribbean colleagues would benefit from that.
So there's, thank you very much for that question. There's been quite a history of terminology. There have been some aspects of confusion, both in terms of terms and in terms of numbers. And so that's still really an evolving process. Some of the folks at the Hugo Institute in Belgium have actually been at the forefront trying to put some of these terms together. There's also been the Groundswell project that looked in part at how we might actually envision the degree of environmental mobility over, say, the first half of this century. And they came up with much more exacting types of numbers, but in the process, they also looked at the terminology. So I think environmental mobility is a pretty good term, also because it distinguishes in part, number one, the fact that some mobility is adaptive. I think that's important to understand. And another part of the globe where we also have island states, we have, for example, the nation of Kiribati, and the Kiribati people are actually planning sort of a major relocation of portions of their population to New Zealand, as there is submergence of some of their very, very shallow, very low elevation atoll, coral atoll islands. And so adaptation is one element. But in addition to that, there's also that concept which we tend to overlook of immobility, populations that are trapped and simply are unable to relocate. So I think that encompassing term is one that's gaining some traction right now, but it certainly has been decades of terminology changes. And when it started out with climate refugees and climate and environmental refugees, that actually set us off probably on the wrong path, and that's been pretty much just sort of withdrawn from the terminology now. So it's an evolving process. So too are the estimates of the numbers of people who are displaced as climate migrants or as persons who are affected by climate change.
Postdocs is going to develop a climate literacy scale, and terminology really matters. So I'm looking forward to connect with you offline on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So Dr. Ora, you really hammered on the fact that we need to train health professionals in a transdisciplinary way. There are a number of, as you shared, and I'll want to ask others who participated in that to comment as well. There are a number of courses and opportunities now, primarily to focusing on practicing professionals. So those are on the front line. Where we're maybe not stuck, but where our next frontier is to embed it into the curricula of schools, whether they're medicine or public health or nursing or pharmacy, or engineering or any of the areas of science that are engaged in climate change, by working with the national accrediting associations. And my question to you is, have we made progress, and what are your thoughts on making progress in that area?
Thanks, Maureen. Yes, I agree. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Certainly in the university systems, changing curricula is quite a challenge. It's a long and difficult process. So, but I don't think we do need to actually formally change the curricula. I think we need to integrate climate change and health into existing curricula, which is a lot easier to do. I think there is certainly amongst the University of the West Indies, I know up in the Bahamas, they're already in the process of integrating climate change and health into the medical curricula. And we're certainly, and I know that Earth and Earth Medic are pushing very hard across the Caribbean to get it integrated. I think the schools, other people might have more experience of this than me. Certainly, we have two of our fellows here, Kim, and certainly Kim, I know, has had a lot of experience with youth, and Kim's actually a teacher as well. The challenges of integrating climate change into our primary and our secondary school curricula is something that we certainly need to do. I think it's probably also a challenge in the Caribbean as well although I don't have experience in that area, to change curricula. But again, it's really getting the lecturers, the teachers, to integrate it into existing programs and to see the need for it. So I think there's a lot of mind changing and education that should happen at a teacher level. So they can this great Columbia thing I talked about today, where you're providing resources, to be able to extend that kind of program where resources are provided to primary school teachers and secondary school teachers, where they can really be supported with easy stories to be able to include some of the climate change and health elements. That would really go a long way, and they could be introduced into the schools. I'm not sure whether, Kim, you have any further thoughts on that, being with your background.
Hi again, Chris, an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. So yes, I fully agree with you that there shouldn't be that, mindset in terms of a change of the curriculum, but more so, especially at the level of the primary and the secondary schools, to more integrate that into the existing programs, because there's always space for that, especially in teaching of science, environmental health, the health sciences that they do at the schools. So that is an easy fix, as opposed to going the route of, changing the curriculum. For me, I agree with you. I don't see the need for that, even at that level. So I am agreeing with you, definitely. Yeah.
So great. I promised that, and I'm glad, Chris, you brought us to stay on this area for just a minute. I'm glad you brought in the teachers, but then there are the students, and what the students want to know. So I'm going to reach out to Farshanda, and I know Farshanda is a medical student. And so how do you see that happening in the Faculty of Medical Sciences and so on?
So I'm really happy that you asked me this question, because Dr. Chris mentioned the Climate and Health Responders course earlier. And I actually also participated in that, and I'm in the working group right now that he also mentioned. And Dr. Hospedales brought up this same point about the education and what the students bring to the table. And both him and what Dr. Chris has presented and your question are actually really inspiring me to maybe personally start doing something about this, because I am also in the student committee of the medical faculty right now. So currently in my medical school, we actually have nothing about climate change in our curriculum. So it would be really a good idea to incorporate that into maybe our public health disciplines, or just some other subjects. And I think it is, like Dr. Chris said, really important to also get the other faculties of the university involved. So maybe the different student committees could form a task group together and help. I don't know if you guys are still hearing me because of my internet, but if we could work together with our deans to try to incorporate this into the curriculum, then we could maybe start with different phases. Like first we start with the medical faculty curriculum, then we go on to the other faculties, and it would be really interesting to have more collaboration with the environmental and medical faculty, because within our medical faculty we do have a lot of collaboration amongst our different areas of expertise, but we don't really have collaboration with the other faculty. So that would be really interesting. And I really think, like he said, also the later on, I think it's a bit easier to start at a university level for the curricula, and then later we can also go to the primary and secondary school levels, which is also important. But for example, the resources that were mentioned, they are really well for the university levels.
And
yeah, I'm after this. Yeah.
No, I'm saying you're right.
Sorry.
But I think the message that we're also hearing from you and from Chris, it's time for us to engage those who teach, following the example from Dr. Schultz, to be willing and a culture change to be willing to integrate. When Haley, when Dr. Sorensen is back, I'd like to give her an opportunity to say what Columbia is doing, because they have a tremendous portfolio in that perspective. James.
Yeah, so yeah, very interested to hear about other opportunities. We do have a climate and health track in our public health program. So it's actually with our Marine campus. So some of the students in my class are actually majoring in climate and health, but also we're in the middle of establishing actually sort of a cycling rotation for our medical students, since Fernanda, you're in medical school, is that right? So this is actually for University of Miami students who will actually be going to Marsh Harbor. You saw the pictures of Marsh Harbor in the middle of the eye of Hurricane Dorian, but there's actually now quarters for them to actually cycle and train and do basically a medical rotation in Marsh Harbor Clinic, and that'll be starting very shortly.
That's great. And so I want to circle back to the audience, and please let me see who you are. But Abigail endorsed Chris's point about collective leadership, and also indicates that there are existing stakeholders in the health sector, and that comes back to Daniel, the next question for you. There are existing stakeholders, but how those stakeholders work together and how we amplify that collaborative approach is critical. So do the tools that PAHO has developed with the countries help do that? And how do they help do that?
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, not just the tools, but I think that the whole, well, one of the key things that we are doing on building health leadership is to create the governance and institutional structures for health to be integrated into the whole climate change discussion. And that's one of the key things that I think that we were able to achieve even before we started this process, even before the EU CARPHA project, where we started training and acting at the highest level with ministries of health. So they are official part of the interministerial committees on climate change in each country. That's what I think that Steve Daniel was referring to on, understanding that we do need these top-down, also this top-down support from ministries, so the technical teams can do their work. That's how we started engaging with countries. So at the highest level, I think that having the Caribbean Action Plan on Health and Climate Change, which was, maybe what I would rate as a successful story of engaging health, ministers of health and ministers at the highest level of health and ministers of climate change or environment in the Caribbean, and they signed together the Caribbean Action Plan on Health and Climate Change. So that's one of the movements that started triggering, more integration between these stakeholders. Then, if we go to the more closer to the planning part on, the latest NDCs from the Caribbean countries, considering 16 Caribbean countries. I think that the latest NDCs, 14 of them have health listed as one of the priority topics in the nationally determined contributions, meaning recognizing that health sits high in the priorities of countries of a climate change implementation agenda. So I think that one thing feeds the other. So having the rights or good governance structures would help us to have better planning on health and climate change, will help us to prepare proposals to address the topics that are needed for climate change and health. And as part of the implementation with regards to infrastructure and services and lowering the carbon emissions from health sectors, but that's integrated with the ultimate goal of a country to reduce their emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and then what are the roles, specific roles of health into that objective. As part of as the surveillance system, so what is the role of health into bridging the health information with other sectors? So we're always doing this movement on building connections with stakeholders. I think that this project allowed us also to engage a lot with academia and civil society as well. So we do have the university here, or not just UE and St. George's University in Grenada and many others with you guys here, and we're doing this movement also with Columbia University. So I think that, you know, every time that we do have the chance, we are trying to merge the parallel tracks that different institutions are having into one and trying to make something coherent and logic for helping countries to implement their agendas. So I think that that's a little bit of the key thing that we should always try to build this, strengthening those connections and make sure that all stakeholders are acting together.
You know, PAHO plays such a critical role, and your leadership is pivotal to bring together those stakeholders, beginning with governmental officials. And so Steve was right to talk about the political will, but it is that kind of multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral approach that is the only way really for us to address it. It's very heartening for me to hear too you say that health is high on the agenda of climate change and climate change investments. So in the chat, Dr. Colford is asking particularly our Caribbean colleagues to complete the survey so that we know what to focus on next time. And it sounds like just around climate change and health, there are a number of topics where we can drill in more deeply. I have to tell all of you that when we discussed this next workshop in the context of COVID, and I reached out to Dr. Cecilia Sorensen, there was no hesitation in saying yes. Cecilia, and then linked also to a comment from Kim in the chat, is what has your center done to engage the faculty, but so the teachers who may not have a degree in climate and health, who are coming from different disciplines in addition to health? How have you engaged them, or how are they engaged from your center to help us increase climate and health learning, beginning with schools of public health? And I know I've been part of the task force that did that, but you are on ground zero when it comes to health education, so please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lickfeld, and thank you so much to our speakers today. This has really been incredible. Where we are based at the Global Consortium at Climate Health Education, we are an open consortium. Any school which trains health professionals is welcome to join. It is completely free. And we have schools of veterinary medicine, of dentistry, of nursing. We have medical schools, we have public health schools. We have over 300 schools from 50 different countries, where at the highest level of the school, the dean or the head of school has pledged to train their health professional students in climate and planetary health. Now, that is incredible. And we are also seeing a huge groundswell from students. I think this upcoming generation of rising health professionals really gets this at a deep level, and they want to be educated on it. So what we're kind of missing there is the faculty to teach. And as this was brought up, so what we are doing is we're doing several things to try to fill that gap. One is that we are offering certificate-based courses. So we have launched courses in North America, in the Caribbean region, as well as in Latin America, and we're about to pilot a course in Southeast Asia. So these are ways that existing health professionals and educators can come and join a cohort of other faculty to really learn the basics on this and to start building their networks. So our courses are one way. We also have several ongoing grand rounds, sort of standing lecture series that are also completely free. Everyone is welcome to attend. And then within the consortium, we have a learning collaborative. So once a month, we come together and we invite different schools from around the world to really talk about their curriculum, talk about what they're teaching, their challenges to it, and how they've been able to integrate it into their schools. We also provide tons of resources, as someone mentioned. We've peer-reviewed evidence-based slides and problem-based learning cases for educators so that we're not having to reinvent the wheel everywhere we go. Now, one thing I would say is, we are strategically and hoping to try to engage, faculty and educators from specific regions to take materials and adapt it to the local context, right? Climate change is going to have different impacts no matter where you go. And we want to make sure that we are preparing current and future health professionals for the realities of where they are. So we really need to ground truth a lot of the education that we're doing. But I would welcome anyone who's interested to come to our events. I will put the link in the chat. All institutions are welcome to join. And we just, continue to push forward. We've had incredible partnerships with many organizations, including PAHO, which has been such a great partner for this, because I think, the education needs to happen on so many different levels. And so we really need that top-down support to make these things a reality. So thank you.
Thank you. And Haley, without whom we couldn't have had this workshop, has put this in the chat. Thank you, Haley. So in our last 10 minutes or so, as you're completing the survey, please do, because otherwise there's no life after this workshop. And I know you want to have that. So we need that kind of deliverable as well. The last deliverable, and that's one promise I made to Dr. Joyce St. John, and don't let me break a promise to Dr. Joyce St. John, because she called me out on it in the first minute of her presentation, is to provide her, and we will have the recording obviously, but is to provide her research gaps, policy gaps, and practice gaps, and in priority order based on what we've heard from the 6 speakers. So I know that Jonathan is not with us, but Liz, I'm going to come to you and to ask you to give us that one, if you're here, that one gap in your area that you presented. And I'm hoping that Liz will join shortly, and there you are. So what's the one area that either in research, policy, or practice that the Caribbean should focus on?
Well, I think I'll come back to the data and the evaluation that was done in 2022 about the details of the food system that need to be expanded and explored. And that includes the connections between climate change and non-communicable disease, on the impacts of climate change on food production, on food safety, and food security. More data and research is needed.
Thank you. And in terms of air pollution, clearly Dr. St. John mentioned some, Dr. Weller mentioned some, and so I'll circle back with Jonathan on that, but I'd love to hear more from everybody here of what you're thinking about priority gaps in terms of research, policy, and practice. On the policy side, we've heard a lot about policies either don't exist, they do exist but are not being implemented, but connecting directly to the tools that PAHO is providing governments to be able to implement those adaptation assessments and vulnerability assessments and to create policy around that. So Dr. Weller, you really, your presentation really provoked thoughts among other speakers and among each of us around the role that mental health plays, the difficulty, using Chris's terminology, the wickedness of climate climate change. So how would you say, and what would you say we should be focusing on in terms of resource policy and practice from that, through that lens?
Thank you. Yes, it has been a pleasure to be part of this. I think the lack of a shared theory of change, of behavior change, that guides our interventions, that supports collaborative work so that we are working to have a synchronized set of interventions. I think that's a big gap. We need to have that shared psychological theory, and then we need to do the research that identifies all the variables and factors and dynamics. But that theory needs to pull it all together so that we're singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. I think that's a big gap to make a big difference in terms of our ability to coordinate and collaborate, to be strategic, and to have the kind of impact we want to have. And just to mention, the behaviors that need to change include our behaviors, as well as those of the general public. So, and that's where the training comes in, and the importance of having this as an important dimension of any training that's being done. People need to understand behavior change. Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much. And so Daniel, what is PAHO's wish now that you have the assessments and the tools and a good number of countries really delivering where PAHO wanted them to go? What would you see be success for PAHO in the Caribbean region when it comes to climate and health? And where are the gaps?
To be honest, I mean, we receive the mandates from countries, right? So it's countries that tell us what they want us to do and what they want us to work on. And we've been having, tremendous interesting interaction with Caribbean countries when we hear their insights and their capacities. It's amazing to see how much capacity there is in the Caribbean region. Not just environmental health officers, chief medical officers, and people who are on the ground as per vector control and using and incorporating climate modeling into that, or on the hurricane response preparedness, on the whole PAHO Smart Hospitals initiative with regards to implementation of infrastructure and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from infrastructure and services provided by health sector. So, I mean, I could go on and on with all the areas that countries are interested on and have already shown capacity to trigger implementation. And we've been learning from countries as well, from Caribbean countries, and also making the best practices available to Latin American countries, as we do have the capacity and the possibility to work with all 35 countries and 18 territories in the region of the Americas. So it's a large group of countries that sometimes they share the same problems, although they can find different or adapt the responses. So that's something else that we are doing now, also with Columbia University and Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, is to build a community of practices where countries can share experiences and can learn from each other and share knowledge and tools. And that's one of the things that I think that is also helping us to go further with the implementation of the specific activities that we do have, that with the funds that we do have, that don't allow us to go and to do everything that we want, all the countries want, but it's a good start. And maybe as the next steps, what we are doing with both the UCARI Farm project and the GCF Readiness project is to prepare this portfolio of projects for countries. So taking their own experience, doing this very good mapping exercise that we're doing on capacities and strengths and vulnerabilities, and then negotiating with each country to understand what are their priorities, where they want to move next, and then building this portfolio of projects with this multi-stakeholder group that we are engaging, like the universities, CARPHA, and all the CARICOM agencies, not just CARPHA, but 5Cs, CARDI, CDMA, and many others. And that's giving us the, this ability of hearing countries first, knowing what they want, learning where they are in terms of implementation, learning their priorities, and then preparing specific response or implementation programs to each one of them. But building that together, so solution won't come from one institution alone. We need to work in collaboration so we can deliver more to the countries and to the populations of the Caribbean who are in need of those solutions.
I think your last statement of solutions won't come from one institution alone could be the framing of this workshop. Thank you so much. So James, to your students and to the professionals here, in addition to terminology, what is it that we can do collectively to assist communities who are faced with whatever we're calling it, forced migration, displacement, environmental immobility? What is it that we can do to be helpful?
So yeah, thank you very much for that question. So my students' class ended at 11:30, so they are not with us at the moment. But my wife is actually one of the psycho-oncologists at our NCI Cancer Center. And so as a psychiatrist with a lot of global health background, she's from Colombia originally, we actually have been very impressed, and this goes with what Dr. Weller was saying as well, with the mental health impact of climate change, including climate-driven disaster events. So I think that's certainly one area. What I'm doing right now is I actually have a program called P3H, which is Protect and Promote Population Health in Complex Crises. A lot of what we're focusing on, which certainly has an overlap with climate change in a big way, is on protecting medically vulnerable patient populations during extreme events. And so, for example, in the Caribbean, there is, there are very high rates of cancer, for example. So we're looking at how do you protect cancer patients, whether it's in Florida, whether it's in the Caribbean. How do you protect patients who require kidney dialysis, patients who have various types of visual or sensory impairments, patients with Alzheimer's? So basically looking at disaster preparedness, but in the context time and time again of climate-driven hurricanes. So we work with atmospheric scientists in terms of looking at the landscape of worsening climate events. But then we also look at medical professionals and public health professionals and how they can actually help special populations of persons who have disabilities and medical, basically NCDs of various sorts that require special care in disaster settings. So it's not just terminology, it's also pretty hands-on mental health and physical health applications for people affected by climate-driven storms and so forth.
And on those front lines, Chris, is where we need to impart that transdisciplinary knowledge. So what would you say currently are the key gaps that we should be focusing on from your perspective in terms of health professions, building the health professions knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, especially it's been very enlightening to hear Dr. Weller talking about the importance of the incorporation of behavioral scientists, because what we're trying to do is we're affecting change here in so many ways. We're from a training perspective, we're focusing very hard on how people can get people to change their actions, their activities, be it high or low level, whatever, community levels or policy levels. So I think it's really, this area should be a focus. I've already got in touch with Dr. Weller already, because I'm going to be in touch with him about getting his input in the fellowship program. But it's great. It's so critical that we have that. We don't forget that those kind of elements when we're developing these kind of training programs. I think they should be at the center stage when we're going forward. Yeah, so there's. I agree with what's been said about the collection and analysis of data, the mental health issues. I agree absolutely that it's important to do the vulnerability assessments and then work according to different needs from different countries and different communities, which will be different in different areas of the Caribbean. I think also we should focus very hard on the non-communicable diseases because they happen to be they're a very big issue when it comes to health across the Caribbean. We've realized that with COVID-19 and how populations in the Caribbean are extremely vulnerable because of those underlying health conditions. So I think NCDs and the effects of climate, heat, whatever on NCDs is a really important area that demands further research within our region.
Thank you. And believe it or not, we could have another afternoon of conversation, but we are at the end of the workshop. Before I thank everybody, I wanted to give Cecilia and Haley a chance to say what will happen next in terms of access to the workshop. And then I want to come back and remind you to submit your survey, as Dr. Kovac mentioned. But first to Cecilia and Haley.
It looks like Dr. Sorensen dropped off, but if everyone could please fill out the survey that Hannah has so kindly posted in the chat, that would be fantastic. And I can send out an email to everybody here today with the session recording. Great,
thank you so much. And then at least me to begin with thanking the team behind the scenes who makes it so, who makes it easy, so it seems easy, it's not. So in addition to the Columbia team, I really want to thank Dr. Kovac and Dr. Abdul Wahid for working on the planning so carefully. I want to thank each of the speakers, Dr. Patz, Dr. Willits, Dr. Weller, Dr. Bruce, Dr. Schultz, and Dr. Ora for contributing so generously to what we need so imminently in the Caribbean region, leaving us with a lot of hope that progress is happening, but also with an agenda where collaboration is needed, intersectoral action is needed, where political will is important, but where tools are being developed, assessments are being done, and where there is a platform that PAHO provides, working with so many of Caribbean organizations to be able to take action because the Caribbean indeed is disproportionately impacted, and where we are all focusing on training the current, but the next generation of health professionals in climate and health. And so I am very thankful that you have been willing to spend a morning with us wherever you are. Wishing you who are in Jamaica a good time on the island and the nation, and an excellent conference. I'm unfortunately not able to join. And so thank you, and we will be in touch with the recordings, but also with the survey link again, if you hadn't had a chance to complete that. Thank you much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.